Throughout time, every murderous dictator has always made sure that special attention was paid to win the hearts and minds of the youth. Mao had the Red Guards, Stalin had the RKSM, and Hitler had his youth. Now, let me ask you a question. If all these dictators had a plan for kids, do you think the adversary of us all might have a program dedicated to our youth? If you're like me, the answer is a resounding yes. Now, if you have any doubts about that, just look around at how our children conduct themselves. When we look objectively at this, I think it becomes clear that we are in a war for our children against the adversary. One of his best weapons in this war for our children is to create the absence of parental guidance to our children. Today, Nate Richardson comes on the podcast to discuss the collapse of parenting. We go over what our children are participating in, what they're exposed to, and how the adversary has taken parents out of their roles. We finally wrap up telling you what we can do as parents to pick our mantles back up again as fathers and mothers to fight this war for the souls of our children. That and more on this episode of the Mormon Renegade Podcast. Look, it's no secret that our society has become much more crude and coarse. To become and raise men and women of virtue and character is a Herculean task. To help with this, I have recently wrote and published a book. Now, back in the 1700s, Washington had a book called Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior in Company and Conversation. It was a book with 110 rules that talked about how to conduct yourself like a civilized person in society, something that today's society is sorely lacking. What I did is I went back through the book and I reinterpreted his original sayings for the 21st century. So the book is laid out in a way in which you see Washington's original rule. Right below that is my explanation for the 21st century, and below that you'll find 2 or 3 examples of where to use this in the real world. Now, to go along with this, there's a workbook that helps parents teach these principles and practices to their kids. To find the book, go to MormonRenegade.com, go to the bottom of the page, search out the blog post, and order your copy today. I can bear personal testimony from personal experience that this is an invaluable tool to help you raise men and women of virtue and character. Mr. Richardson, back again. How's it going?
Awesome. Thank you.
Nice. So, dude, when you came and when we talked about this, the collapse of parenting, I was like, oh yeah, I want to get on top of this one because, dude, it's true, right? I mean, we look around at our kids today, like, I remember once I was walking into the store with my wife here in Utah. And I'd held the door open for my wife. And this kid just like cuts in, right? Right in front of her. And I looking back, I shouldn't have done it because I'm sure he was like 17 or 18 tops. But I just kind of grabbed him and I was like, slow down, son. Right? I was like, we let the ladies go first, right? And this was just something my dad instilled in me. Like if I ever did not get the door, to this day, I'm a big believer that my dad would come back from the grave and grab me with his great big mechanic hands and give me the beating I deserved. So
well, that's a good reminder.
I think that this is really sorely needed.
Yeah, there's a fun story in one of the Jordan Peterson books where he talks about this. There's this kid on the playground who's just not listening to, the adults present and just being a little rebel rouser and causing problems. And he says, it talks about how these parents, they'll like threaten their kids and then not do anything. So then the kid learns like, oh yeah, parents, they say stuff and it doesn't mean anything. We just, parents, and they really learn to resent adults. They resent authority. And eventually they're going to become an adult. So they're going to wind up presenting themselves. Anyway, he says he took the kid and, the kid steps on this other kid's hand, on purpose. And and then the kid looks at the adult on the playground, which is Peterson, and he sticks out his tongue like, "Hey, what are you gonna do about it?" You know. So
No.
Peterson says, "I picked up that kid and chucked him across the field." And he says he didn't really actually get to do that, but he should have, is what he said. But yeah, the big point of collapse of parenting book. It's by Dr. Leonard Sachs. It's about how the kids are ruling the roost. Um, the kids are not being treated like kids; they're being treated like adults, and that's the subtitle of the book is how we hurt kids when we treat them like adults. So yeah, I'd love to talk about that with you and throw in some 2 cents here and there and some LDS, particularly LDS analysis on it.
Let me ask this question. When you say we don't treat our kids like kids, but we treat them like adults, let's break down the age gap here. What ages are we talking where we treat them like adults instead of kids? Because to me, I feel like sometimes we don't expect enough out of our kids, right? Like if you look at Washington at 16, he's Fairfax County, Virginia's county surveyor, right? He's
Yeah.
leading men into the wilderness. Um, shouldn't there be an age? Like I'm not a huge believer in this idea of the teenage years, right? I'm a big
Yeah.
fan, especially when it comes to young men, of rites of passage, right? Judaism has a beautiful one in a bar mitzvah, right? Is you
Yeah.
went from being a child to a man, albeit a young man who still needed guidance, but now you're a man. You're going to start acting like a man. So where's the cutoff age here?
Yeah, and those bar mitzvahs, as I recall, they're around age 12 or 13.
Mm-hmm.
So it's nice and young. And then the Hispanics, they do their quinceañeras, the 15 and all that. So anyway, both cultures are pointing to a time in history where the age of adult was not 18. It was basically when nature said you're an adult, which is puberty. And puberty can change based on a lot of things, like actually your diet. Um, kid can, I think kids today go through puberty at a little younger age than historically, but um, yeah. So obviously yeah, the title of the book is actually a little misleading. When I first saw that, I was a little bit thrown off. I was like, I don't really want a book that says pamper kids like more than we already are. Like, what's this about? I've been through the book several times now, and it was really, yeah, he could have picked a better subtitle. But what he means is don't let your kids, for example, a kid who's going to school. Sometimes a parent will say, "Hey, you're going to be homeschooled because we're your parents and we feel like that's what needs to happen." Or, "Hey, you're going to go to this charter school." Or, "Hey, we're going to move to this certain area because it's what we feel is best for the family." A lot of parents now, he points out in the book, are letting the kids make those decisions when those are really more of adult
Gotcha.
decisions to
Gotcha. That
make.
makes sense.
Yeah.
I do want to point something else out, and I just thought about this, and I feel like I have to say it because I'm a Mormon fundamentalist. When I say that kids should be more responsible at age 15 and 16, in no way am I making the insinuation that kids should be getting married at 15 or 16. Let's get
Right.
that off the table now.
Yep. Let's do that.
I'm not a proponent of that. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying expect more of your kids when they are, 14, 15, 16. Give them adult tasks, but I'm not talking about marriage and starting a family. So let's get that off the table. So,
Yeah. Yeah. The kids, you know, yeah, we want to keep all the laws. We're United States citizens. We like our country, and um, our culture uh, has done a bad job of pampering young people to almost make it to where the kids think there's a switch that gets flipped when you turn 18, to where, oh, I wasn't responsible and now I am responsible. And one of the points that he makes in Collapse of Parenting is that there's not that magic flip of a switch at 18. Um, he says a big misconception is that if we let kids, if we, I mean, obviously it's kind of like government. There needs to be a happy medium. Like we don't
right.
want tyranny and we don't want anarchy. We want what's in the middle. And it's kind of the same with parenting. Like we don't want to be like, yeah, do whatever you want, but we also don't want to be, hey, every detail of your life I'm gonna spell out for you.
Right.
But there's this really popular idea that if a parent is strict, that the kid will grow up, he'll slam through the doors at his 18th birthday and never see his parents' face again, and he's gonna go sow his wild oats and all this. And this is what Dr. Sachs says about this. He gives an example about how there's this kid who all his other friends were playing all these video games, and he was like, "Hey, I want to do this too." And let's be honest, video games are not exactly high quality time, and there's a lot of problems with the gaming obsession. Anyway, this parent had decided, not that every parent has to make this decision, but this parent decided we're not going to do video games in my house. And the boy thought, oh man, when I'm 18, I'm going to go get these consoles and just be like all the other guys. And so he came around, he turned 18, he went out, he got the consoles, and they actually ended up just collecting dust because he learned when he was young and impressionable that gaming is not reality, and that, excuse me, that reality is better than the game world. So when all his friends kept on these video game that took up a lot of their adult life as well, he was able to have real culture and real social skills and things that are really meaningful in life, a real job, real relationships. So the video games just collected dust and he never used them. He just pawned them off because when a kid is young, that's when they're the most impressionable. Um, that's when they're, if he grows up playing a lot of video games as a small kid, he's gonna think, oh, video games are the world. They're awesome. And for young girls, it's less gaming, it's more of the social media and the selfies and the texting, just the constant into all that. So if we put on the proper limits on our kids, they're gonna be more mature. Another thing that he talks about is, look at, if you're trying to hire somebody for a job, do you want the guy who has the track record of being a reliable person, or do you want the person who is known for like showing up late all the time, like dressing sloppy, doing all these things? Obviously, you're going to want to hire the person with a good track record. And it's the same way of, if you can get your kids to manage themselves, to act well, to be neat and comely, to do all these responsible things, when they turn 18, they're going to keep that momentum going forward. Um, and Elder Holland, actually, one of my favorite quotes, anybody could have said it and it would be amazing, but he said, second only to your love, your kids need your limits.
Mm-hmm.
And that's big time missing right now, the limits.
I remember something my dad said once, and I'll never forget this as long as I live, and it stuck with me. I remember that um, I used to verbally spar with my dad in fun, right? But I knew there was a limit, right? There were certain things that were off the table. But other than that, he would let me, have fun with him and that sort of stuff. And now my old man was raised, up in the Great Lakes. He was a great big guy. I mean, he's probably 4 inches taller than I am now, and he was just a big guy, and raised very old school. And I remember my uncle was over, and me and my dad had just kind of verbally, had fun with each other, poked fun at each other or whatever. And I remember I went to my room, but my door was open. And I remember my uncle told my dad, he said, hey, listen, you can't let your son do that to you. He's like, your son doesn't fear you enough. And I
Right.
remember my dad said something very profound. He said, look, here's the thing. I don't want my kids to fear me. I want them to respect me. And I remember my uncle said, well, what's the difference? And he said, if my kid is in trouble and he fears me, he won't come to me. If he respects me, he'll come to me and we can work it out. And sometimes I think as parents, we want to be liked too much, right? At the expense of kids having respect for us. Now, certainly, you can ask every kid that I ever raised, they were way more scared of their mom than they were of me. Um, but there was a limit, right? They knew what things were off the table. And we have to set those limits, and we have to, we have to be able to say, this is acceptable and this is not. If we come from a place of constantly trying to, um, and I've seen this where we educate instead of discipline. Sometimes discipline is warranted, and sometimes discipline is needed. And um, education is great, and I'm a big believer in talk to your kids on why we do what it is we do. But when those rules are broken, there has to be some sort of discipline and consequence that goes with it, or else they're suggestions and not rules.
Yeah, there needs to be, the old saying is the white glove with the iron fist, right?
Right.
You need to, no needs to actually mean something. When you say no, it's like, or else what? Um, Another story from the book is there's this kid, he's buzzing around in a classroom, and the teacher's like, you need to stop that. And he's like, yeah, he just ignores and keeps doing it. And finally the teacher says, you need to stop that or else. And the kid says, or else what? And excuse me, the teacher said, yeah, the teacher stopped it or else. He says, or else what? So now she's got his attention. There's the possibility to where this teacher's actually going to do something. And she says, or stop or else I'll make you stop. And so he goes on buzzing and he wants to see what's going to happen. And she comes over to try and get him to stop, and he bites her wrist, drawing blood. And long story short is she goes to the principal. She calls the parent, um, and the parent actually says, "Oh, well, don't you know he has a psychiatric diagnosis? You should have called his psychiatrist instead of calling me um, about a possible."
Whoa.
Yeah. So here's this lady, and she's totally transferring all her parental authority over to a psychiatrist, you know. And the academic leaders, the principals, they used to, when a kid was misbehaving in class, Sachs points this out, the principal used to call the parent and say, "Hey, your kid is out of control. He needs to learn how to shape up and respect our rules here and all this, or he can't be here." But nowadays, a parent will just refer the kid to a psychiatrist to get counseling and diagnosis, because it's easier to tell a parent, hey, your kid has an illness and he needs medicine, than to tell a parent, you're not training your kid right. You know what I mean?
Right. You know,
Um, Go ahead.
the I feel like COVID pointed this out a whole bunch. I feel like COVID really exposed this. Um, I remember I heard a lot people saying, I don't know what to do with my kids now. They're not in school. Um, that was a sad thing whenever I heard it, Nate, because I'm like, they're your kids. You are uniquely qualified to be able to be with them and to help them. But somewhere along the line, to go back to what you were saying, um, we absolutely farmed out our parental rights to the quote the experts, whether that's a teacher, whether that's a psychiatrist, whatever the case is. We completely vacated that spot as a parent in favor of a technocrat or some sort of technician. And the problem with that is that whether you're a god guy like you and I are, or whether you're um a person who believes even in evolution, quite frankly, you're still uniquely qualified to be your kids' parents. They are yours. And this idea of, well, it takes a village to raise a kid. No, it takes you getting the hell out of my living room and I'll deal with it.
Yeah.
And somehow we got to this place where we just absolutely vacated the role of parenting and turned over the responsibility of instilling values and principles to a school or a psychiatrist or whatever the case is.
Yeah, it's really sad because the community has encroached so much. We talked a little bit about discipline, and the author, Sachs, uh he says, discipline doesn't always need to mean, the SWAT or whatever, but whatever you do, discipline does need to be happening. Um, and discipline comes in many forms, like it could be the timeout, the time in, the hey, this privilege is revoked, hey, we're gonna have this conversation and it's gonna be awkward for you, or hey, you need to make this public apology. Like the list is endless of what our strategies and tools are as parents. But when it comes to the spanking, which I have mixed feelings on because I don't like the idea, but I do feel like you need to have that as a almost like an emergency option for when the kid's not responding to other stuff. But I just want to point out this the state now, the kids are learning at the public schools that spanking is abuse.
Mm-hmm.
So, and there's some places around the world where it's not legal. In the United States it is, in Utah it is. I there's a basically the law is, you know, you're not going to want to be leaving marks on your kid, you're not going to be wanting to be excessive or anything. But yeah, the kids these days, they don't believe their parent has any authority. It's always like, oh, you can't do that, or the it's so this author, he gives lectures around the world, and he's a medical doctor, and he's a psychologist, and he's he he points out how in America these problems are particularly bad, how there's this culture of disrespect in America. He would go around the world doing these lectures. He was in Australia, and he was talking to educators, and he says, now, I'm sure you guys all have the problem with your students doing this and doing that during your class and making this confrontation. And the Australian educators were like, no, actually, we don't have those problems. And what Sachs found out was that America is particularly diseased with disrespectful kids. Um, it's in the classrooms, it's in the homes, it's basically that the kids have found a way. It's almost like how in the 60s and 70s the liberals found their ways to take over the universities. Well, the kids have now found their ways to take over the homes, and the schools and the everything is in 1984 where the kids like just turn in their parents for stuff against the
Sure.
government. Yeah, like that's gosh, it's terrifying.
But
I
see,
I uh
oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say a little bit about my background. I was a foster parent for 8 years. I adopted a bunch of kids from foster care. I have some biological kids. Most of my kids, I have 11 kids, and I have they're all, my oldest is 15. So, and we've had, a handful, like 20 or something, foster kids that came and went back to their houses and all this. So but we've seen the even the foster program is like, if a kid in your house doesn't like you, they'll just tell their caseworker, oh yeah, either exaggerate something, or foster parents frequently get these they're frequently under investigation. And I'm not saying there's not bad foster parents who do need to be investigated and need to be,
Mm-hmm.
uh punished by the law for not respecting children's rights. But it's like yeah, it's pretty wild, um how much
Here,
the state's in charge.
I'm going to say something here that's probably going to piss a lot of people off, and I want to apologize ahead of time, but I see it being the truth. And I know that you're an educator as well, Nate.
Yeah.
And so don't take this personally, because I'm not talking about you specifically. I'm not talking about anyone in particular. But the fact that the schools are starting to complain about this now, I find somewhat laughable because they're kind of responsible for this, right? My kid came home many times um, from high school where they would have recorded something during a lecture where a teacher would say, look, now a lot of your parents, they're not going to believe in global warming. You're way smarter than your parents.
Oh my
Um,
gosh.
you need to, really take what they say with a grain of salt. And it would be over other things too, right? Where your parents are going to have this point of view, but really it's this, right?
Yeah.
So when you send a kid to school for 8, 9, sometimes 10 hours a day, if they're in extracurriculars, and they get messages of, hey, your parents, you're so much smarter than your parents. They're just stuck in the past. They don't understand. We as your educators, we get it. Well, what did you think was going to happen? Right? I mean, you've undermined the the linchpin of every single um fabric that holds a society together. At its base level, society is a collection of individuals and families. And when you start to mess with that fabric, of course you're going to see problems. And a lot of these things that we're seeing now, yes, the parents were happy to vacate the role of a parent, but the educators in the state, I believe, were more than willing to instill the state's values into those kids. And a lot of those state's values run contrary to what you and I would consider traditional family relationships. And so the fact now that schools are complaining about it, I got no time. You know what? You help create the problem. You get to be part of you get to lay in that bed as well.
Yeah, and it's bouncing back on educators too. Yeah. Um the problems in school, oh boy. Um I have kids. Well, I worked at most of my teaching has been at a residential where, basically troubled kids. You know, but be there, or even just the public school, the kids will tell the teacher to shut up or this and that. And the message that another thing is, in America, we often like glorify youth. We got all these billboards all over the place of how to stay young, and we just basically worship youth. And what we've traded it for is wisdom, and so we don't respect our elders here in America. It's kind of funny. Anytime I like want to show my kids something that's maybe like a recording in black and white or something like that, they just immediately shut down, like, oh no. And it's old. And I'm like, you realize the earth was uh a good place even before you showed up on it, right?
Right.
like
Right.
like there's you know so anyway, the culture of disrespect in America. Another big thing is, if the kids, and I agree with you, by the way, that it's good for the kids to respect their parents, not necessarily fear them. Fear is kind of a loaded word. It's kind of like how discipline is a loaded word, spank is a loaded word. Like there's a whole spectrum of what this means, right? And the scripture even says, um, the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, right?
Right.
And the scripture says, God, there's tons of references to where God's like furious. And the so anger itself is really a hard topic, because the worst mistakes of your life you're probably going to make because you were angry. I mean, as far as parenting goes, um and there's this Orson Pratt, he had a little thing on parenting, and he said, don't ever discipline your kid when you're angry, because it's not going to go so well. But let's take that with a grain of salt. Anger, there's a spectrum, right? There's like totally blitz out of control anger, or there's like, hey, I'm going to raise my voice, I'm going to let you know I'm serious. I'm gonna let you know that what you do is completely uncalled for, and and that what you did offends me and upsets me, and is not okay with me. It's not what we've raised you to do, and so you do have to have a relationship, of course. Look at the Doctrine and Covenants. Some of the times when Joseph Smith gets roasted by the Lord, man, I wouldn't want to be Joseph at those moments, because he gets it thick sometimes. But of course, the Lord had that relationship with Joseph.
Mm-hmm.
So when we have the relationship with our kids, we can be more down to earth and do what we need to do. Um,
I think you hit on a key thing there, being in control, whether
yeah,
that is spanking, whether that is another form of disciplining. Look, I got I can literally remember 5 times is all that my old man laid hands on me. And in every instance, I can totally remember, even at my young age, I was like, I have this coming, right? Like I knew, right? So my dad didn't overuse it.
yeah.
That's interesting about Orson Pratt. I'm going to throw out another quote here to you, and I want to see if you can peg this. You probably know who it is. He said, "It's been my experience that the use of the rod is more the result of a spoiled parent than a spoiled child." You want to take a guess on who said that?
Um, I could guess Brigham. I don't know.
That was Brigham.
Okay.
That was Brigham. Yeah, no, I found it interesting, right? And so even Brigham is seeing, because I do think that maybe in the old days we were too quick to break a child's spirit,
Yeah.
right? And as you listen to Brigham talk, he's like, look, we need to provide discipline and structure, but we don't need to break a child. We just need to harness it.
Right.
We need to teach him what to do with those passions and whatnot. And really, when I look at parenting, I think one of the biggest places we have vacated is the space in which we can teach our children how to harness who it is they are, right? All of our kids come kind of how they are, right? I understand there's things that we can do to influence their attitudes or whatnot, but a lot of that is they're still just people, right? And they come kind of with their own identities. You and I believe it's because we lived in another place before we came here. I had one son who was absolutely stubborn. I mean, stubborn, like me stubborn. It was so ridiculous, right? And I swore I was never going to get him pointed in the right direction, but it finally happened. And what I've discovered is that thing that I used to have to contend with him, that being stubborn, is now a tool in his, or an arrow in his quiver that he uses when he wants to do something good. Oftentimes it's not about just correcting an attitude. It's about learning, it's about teaching that kid where that attitude is appropriate and when to use it and how to use it.
Yeah. The same goes for arrogance and pride. There's a good side and a bad side. And yeah, it's almost like you need it's really great when you can get, the wife involved and have a little discussion with the kid before administering whatever consequence it is that you get chosen on, because you want to have a level head, and you want to make sure that the kid understands that, there's a reasonable thing of why this consequence he's getting this consequence. Um, so there's this spectrum, right, of how historically you mentioned that at the time of the early saints, a lot of what went on in the world is probably excessive discipline. Um, and now I think it's pretty easy to see that with the pendulum swung the other way,
Right.
and we're too soft. And but I want to the too soft doesn't necessarily mean get out your rods. It's time for anyway. Um, it can mean we're too uninvolved is another big part of it, because of what the social sciences are repeating now is that parents need to have high love and high involvement, basically. Um, one of the at the at the place I work, we have staff who will help be with the kids throughout the day and all this, and there's some of them just kind of let misbehaviors go, and other ones that, hey, that's not appropriate, we need you to cut that out. So it didn't turn into a big old situation, but are these parent figures, are we pointing it out or just letting it slide? Because a strict conscience will tell you, it'll point out, hey, that wasn't good. and you need to address it. And even if it's like, okay, I'm sorry, even if you know you're going to screw up again, it's at least acknowledge that there's a problem. But it's the ones that never, like, okay, this kid just, used the F-bomb and or told a authority figure to shut up or something. Like, you can't let that slide. You've got to, consistently be involved, and it can be exhausting. Parenting is exhausting. But we'll talk also about like how certain types of parenting are more exhausting in a bad way than others. Um, Sachs points out how when you
Before
actually
we
let your sorry.
before we go there, what has caused this? What has caused parents to just let go of their responsibility of being parents?
Yeah, maybe the media. So the grandparents, they had more power and influence on their kids than our parents had on us, and now we, just general societal trend, we have less power and influence over our kids. Let's One example is TVs in the bedroom. For a long time, the church was saying, "Don't put your TV in the bedroom," and don't let a kid have a TV in his bedroom. And there's, I don't remember which society, I don't think it was the APA, but some society was saying, and some medical children's society said, yeah, research shows you do not want a screen in your kid's bedroom. And um and then what did the media do? They came out and said, oh yeah, that's ridiculous. Don't even worry about that. That's like so unachievable. And so they just undermine sound wisdom, and they undermine scientific research on what's most likely to create success. Anyway, what's causing this? That's a good question, man. Yeah,
Because I it's good to talk about the symptoms, right? But I feel like if all we do is address the symptoms, it doesn't necessarily affect a solution. Um, I'll be honest, and again, this is going to be wildly unpopular. Okay, let me preface this by saying one of my wife's does work, but started working after our kids were all teenagers.
yeah,
When there had to be a two-parent income to make things to make ends meet. And look, I live along the Wasatch Front. I see it. I understand that you have to do that. The problem is that I don't know if it was by design. I don't know if it was by design of the adversaries, and then we were useful idiots to him. But what I look at is when mom started going to work is when a lot of these problems started to flare up.
yeah,
Um, and that's because when mom had to go to work, that means the kids were left unsupervised for a few hours in the morning and in the evening. How do you fill those hours? You turn on the television.
yeah,
And I think that sometimes a lot of these problems, or I won't even say sometimes, I believe a lot of these problems came into being once both parents had to go to work just to make ends meet.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, and the kids, they learn that there's this transfer of authority. That the yeah, it seems like there's just a multitude of ways that the attack is happening. And obviously, you look at the family proclamation, and just the obvious scriptural warning that when the family is not intact, everything is just gonna blow up. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Interesting. All right, where are we heading next?
Um, so you'd brought up how Brigham was talking about not how sometimes it's the parents who lack the skills when the whip's being used all the time. I did have one that I was going to read to you. This is Brigham. He said, "It is not by the whip or the rod that we can make obedient children. It is by faith and by prayer. and by setting a good example before them.
Mm.
So that's important. And then yeah, because when we talk about parenting, we need to we always need to have the doctrine of the tenderness in place. No matter what else we discuss, we need that foundation of love and kindness for the kids. Joseph Smith, he said, nothing is so much calculated to lead people to forsake sin as to take them by the hand and watch over them with tenderness. When persons manifest the least kindness and love to me, oh, what power it has over my mind, while the opposite course has a tendency to harrow up all the harsh feelings and depress the human mind. Um, we also have Brigham. He said, parents should never drive their children, but lead them along, giving them knowledge as their minds are prepared to receive it. Chastening may be necessary at the times, but parents should govern their children by faith rather than by the rod, leading them kindly by good example. Um, and Brigham Young's kids, they attested that he was this tender parent. Um, uh, his daughter Sousa said, "None of us feared him; all of us adored him." Um, so yeah, Brigham, he was big on this, that we do need to be um you think of, gosh, the impossible standard, well, the Christian standard of if this was, if I, how would God treat this child of his and all that. um but yeah, with the disciplining, we do, there are kids, um whether you're raising a single parent family where the dad's not there to kind of lay down the law, or if you're getting a kid, who's adopted kid who, the first half of his childhood didn't know any rules or structure, um or let's say a typical family, and some kids are just more rebellious than others and a little hard-headed, um or all these different scenarios to where there are these times when you've got the need to use discipline. The so the You basically have to establish that there is law and order in the home. Another thing that Dr. Sachs points out is a lot of the times the correct answer for a rule in the home is because I said so. We're afraid of that now, and older kids do need more explaining, but it's totally legitimate to have a rule, which is, hey, one of the things you need to learn in this house is respect for authority. And that's it's we learn in the church that um obedience is the first law of heaven, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it probably needs to be the first law of our homes. And there's ways that parents um can can turn that authority around to where the kids are each other's authority versus the parents get the authority back. And you can even have a little family meeting and announce it and say, hey, we're going to be doing this around here now. Things are going to be changing around here. Um, One of the things that Dr. Sachs cautions parents against is the kids are being cultured by their peers instead of their parents. Um, for example, the family vacation. If your family's going on a vacation and your kid says, I don't want to go, I don't even like skiing, or I don't like hiking, or I don't like lakes, or I don't like everything that's good and beautiful about this life. I want to stay home and I'll just stay at my neighbor's house. Um, so he says that's a big no-no. Do not let that happen, because your kid is not being independent. They are being, they're transferring their dependence onto someone else.
Mm-hmm.
And and another important point that a lot of us probably didn't catch is he says, don't bring friends on your family vacations,
Mm-hmm.
because then it becomes an expensive play date. Your kid just focuses all his time and attention on building a relationship with the friend, when the whole purpose of that vacation was to build a relationship with each other as family members. And something we've been telling our kids lately is, look, if you've got these if you can smile and be happy with your friends, but be resentful and pessimistic with us, that's a relationship problem. That's what Dr. Sachs points out as well, is that's a relationship problem. So we do need to get out more. We need to do more as a family. We need to, and the kid can be kicking and screaming. Sometimes it's like, hey, I'm sorry, we're going on this trip. And and when a kid learns that they can have fun with their parent, then they really the relationship really changes. So one of the things that the book goes into is why kids are overweight, and he puts the blame on how the parents are, again, just letting the kids do whatever they want. So should we get into that a little bit?
Yeah, let's get into that.
Okay. So um, in the 1970s, the norm in America was if you don't like what's served for dinner, you're gonna go hungry.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Nowadays, it's a debate. It's a you choose. Uh, it's a, hey, eat your vegetables and you can have dessert. Well, now it's, well, okay, how about eat two pieces of broccoli and you can have your dessert. So it's getting less and less and less. Whereas in the past it was like, hey man, take it or leave it. This is what we prepared for you, you know. Um, and that's, I get that there's some kids with this eating disorders and different, like, yeah, that's not a one size fits all. But generally speaking, you're not starving your kid. You're giving them the option to eat. Most homes do 3 meals a day. And what this Dr. Sachs says is, by and by, they'll get hungry and he says this mom came into him and she's like, he just won't eat any vegetables because this kid was having health problems because he was malnourished. And she's like, we offer him these foods, but all he wants is like Slurpees. And that's like all we can get him to eat. And Dr. Sachs is like, well, he would eat it if he was hungry enough. So
Yeah,
that's
I think another reason for childhood obesity, and I know me talking about obesity is a lot like Cheech and Chong being the spokesman for just say no to drugs. But
no, man.
I'm,
That's no.
here's what I'm going to say, right? Is that we have two things that are working against us in this aspect. One is we keep comparing former generations. And certainly I am a big fan of looking back because I feel like there's a lot of answers there. And I think throughout this conversation, I may sound like a broken record, so I apologize. But part of the problem is this, going back to both parents having to work now, right? Your kid gets home and he's just eating whatever junk is in the cupboard, right? It's not like that kid's like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to make me a salad. Oh, no. That kid is going to the freezer to look for ice cream, chocolate bars, or whatever else he can get his hands on.
Yeah.
The other thing is we're never home anymore, Nate.
Yeah.
As I look around at, let's just take the average family along the Wasatch Front here. If you got kids that range from the age of 6 on up, you got a decent sized family, 4 kids, you're running. You're taking one kid to ballet, you're taking another kid to football practice, you're taking another kid to gymnastics or whatever the activities are, right? Mom is exhausted. She's been working all day. Dad's exhausted. He's been working all day. And now all of a sudden, what are you serving? Something that's
Yeah.
highly processed, that is, you know, got a ton of calories, not good ones, right? Something that you can throw in a microwave. And
Yeah.
as I look at this, it is such, I see the fingerprints of the adversary all over all of this, right?
Yeah. During our
Um,
health.
we're never home together as a family. I would be fascinated to find out what the percentage of Americans who eat together as a family now is.
Yeah.
I'm guessing it's pretty low. Um, and there were a lot of things that got worked out over the family dinner table that aren't getting worked out now. In addition to good, high quality food, they're just all over the map running around. And again, it's a clever ploy by the adversary, right? Because none of the stuff they're doing is inherently bad. It's just sometimes there's a good, better, best kind of mentality. that we need to start adopting. And me and my wife went through this. Unfortunately, my wife is way smarter than I am and way more in tune. And she just basically said, I think we need to limit each kid to one activity, right? Or
Yeah,
else we're never going to be home together.
right.
And I think this part about kids being overweight now have a lot to do with the fact that there's not parents at home. And it's really rough. And I remember, because I'm a huge nerd. Do you remember who Norman Schwarzkopf was?
No.
Oh, you would have loved him. Stormin Norman Schwarzkopf. He was a general during the first Gulf War. So Colin Powell was the main guy, and then Schwarzkopf was right below him.
Yeah.
And they asked, after the war, they asked Schwarzkopf what his plan was, why it was so effective, right? And he said it was simple. I first cut off the head of the snake and then I let the body of the snake die. And they said, well, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, if you cut off communication, everything else falls into disarray and then we can just pick them off one by one. And
Yeah.
I feel like that's what's happened with the American family, is that if you can cut the head off of the family, the mom and dad, well, then it's easy to pick off the rest of them. And we've allowed it to happen because none of it was bad, right? It wasn't, I mean, you can't point at football as being bad. You can't point at ballet as being bad. You can't point at gymnastics as being bad, right? And you want your kids to be active and stuff, but at what cost? Um,
Yeah.
and so I feel like a lot of these problems are, we're now at a point where it's going to take some radical solutions.
Yeah, there's studies that show that the number of dinners a kid has with his family per week is statistically significant. If it's 7 family dinner nights a week, the kid's gonna do better than the kid with 6. And the kid that has 6 family dinner nights a week is gonna do the kid with 5. At every single step, it's statistically significant that by all the measuring we have um, of uh, of children and how well they're doing, the family dinners are just the deal breakers. It's interesting how in the church we had the, you know, I don't even remember who instituted it, but the family home evening. Do
Yeah.
you remember who was that? McKay or what was that?
Well,
I don't know.
there is, hold on one second. Let me see if I can look this up real quick, because um I have an interesting story on this. Give me just one second here, Nate. Because
Okay,
I remember who you were talking about. Who
I'll ramble a bit while you're looking
Yeah,
that up. So the general idea is you guys we all need to be having family time on a regular basis.
right.
And it seems like the minimum, like the lowest requirement is for goodness sake, have at least one a week, right? Have one evening a week where you're having family time. But that's probably not the ideal, it's probably like we need it way more often than that. And if you want to at least survive, at least do it one night a week. Um, but there's a big problem with the how we say, it's almost like, you know, when you hear people talking about how busy they are, it almost is bragging to an extent
Mhm.
where they'll be like, "Oh, I'm just so busy. I don't have time for this, I don't have time for that, and we're never home. We're always going from one place to the other, and I would love to do that, but I'm just so busy." And it's it's like we need to make the faithful choice to be less busy. And
Right.
you know, I love those ads that the church used to run on. Well, they anyway, I don't know if they do, but on how family is about time and all this. And so yeah, we're obsessed with being busy. And the sad reality is maybe we need to, as a society, give up the McMansion, give up the new car, give up all this stuff that's taken us away. um President Spencer Kimball gave a really good talk called "The False Gods We Worship." I think that's what it was, where he talks about you know all these financial things we're so obsessed with now are eating away our family time.
So I found out which president of the church rolled it out, and it was actually Joseph F. Smith.
Okay, yeah, that. Yeah,
But
that
but
sounds
Joseph F. Smith got the idea from a close personal friend, and here's where I'm going to do my little thing, who was a
okay.
polygamist of all things. And he had said, I'm having a hard time getting my family together, right? I got all these responsibilities. And he came up with this idea and pitched it to Joseph F. Smith. And he's like, I like that. Um, so yeah, you can thank polygamists for family home evening. You're welcome, everybody.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. I'm glad we
that's
have it. 'Cause
that's
it
just a
helps us
joke.
get on the right track.
That's just a joke. But here's the thing. You were talking about, what it is we're going to have to do. And what I'm about to say is also going to irritate some people, and I get it. If you live in an area that requires a two-income home and you have young kids, you might want to think about moving.
Yeah,
You might want to think about pulling up stakes and going somewhere else where you can make it on one income.
yeah,
And there's been plenty of times on this podcast I have made the suggestion, maybe it's time to move somewhere where you can homeschool your kids, where you can move around like-minded people, and where you can live in an area that's not so expensive so you can make it on one income.
yeah, yeah. That's the quest of our time. Is to have time to parent, right?
I feel like we're past the time of half solutions, that if we really want to save our families, we better start thinking about radical solutions at this point.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Um, so yeah, family home evening is a great thing that helps us, you know, because we live in this society where it's always this go, 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 fast pace, and it's where we get to say, okay, boots, we're putting our foot down and we are gonna do this. Um, one of the things with the kids overweight, this gets back into the parental authority. So Michelle Obama made this school policy where the schools were going to provide more healthy food. Okay, so if you're familiar with the public school lunches and all this, it's trash. And she says, all right, we're going to give more healthy food as an option here. But that was the problem, is they gave it as an option. So what happened was they had garbage cans full of healthy food because the kids were still choosing the trash. And this is what we mean by treating the kid like a grown-up. You you can't constantly put water and wine in front of your kid and say choose the water every time. You can't, put French fries and potatoes in front of your kid and expect them to choose the potatoes. At some point, you have to only offer the good thing.
Can't get enough of the Mormon Renegade podcast? Well, good news. We're on Patreon, and there's 3 packages that you can choose from. The first one, the Slightly Rowdy package, allows you to hear the podcast without all those pesky commercials getting in the way. For those who want a slightly more in-depth experience, there's the Stirring It Up package, where you can hear ad-free audio, ad-free video, and transcripts. Finally, for those who want to go full Renegade, that package is available too, where you can get everything in the previous 2 packages, plus an extra show where myself and Ben Winfield break down the news of the day from a very Mormon point of view. You will also get exclusive access to Renegade Chat, and on there you'll be able to talk to others about the show or whatever topics are on your mind. Go to Patreon today and get your exclusive content.
And later, obviously they're going to be adults and choose what they choose. But if they learn that they have the capacity to make healthy choices, they're going to learn, hey, I feel good. Look at my friends are getting all huffing and puffing after they try to run a mile, you know? So that's the problem, is we can't just, say, hey, here's the cocaine and here's the salad. Good luck. We have to be the adults. We have to step in and say, no, this is not going to happen. And that's why her school program failed. And frankly, that's another, you know, we'll plug for homeschool whenever we get the chance. And that's another thing, is this toxic food at these schools. And you know, um, that's a that's the thing. What do you think about that, Dave?
Look, I have no doubt that the food at school absolutely sucks, right? Anything that's produced on that level can't be great. Um, but I'll say this, right? And this is where I really continue to go back to we need a makeover of all of society, right? Because for some kids, that could be the only meal they get,
Sure.
right? And so when a kid's in that point, I mean, how do you even do that? Like, I'll be honest, and this is something I've been thinking about a lot, and it ties into this. It feels like we are forcing mankind to do things that are just not conducive with the human experience, right? I look at social media. You want to talk about the most ineffective way for two people to communicate?
Yeah.
It's through text, it's through social media. We're running a social experiment that we don't know the outcomes yet. We're starting to get a pretty good idea, right? Um, Cramming guys into a cubicle for 8 hours a day does not make sense. For some people that works, but for a lot it doesn't. Um, we are living sedentary lives that the human body just wasn't meant to live. We are
Yeah.
ingesting media that just really has no place anywhere. And we're doing this, and I've felt this for a few years now. I feel like we are living the most inauthentic ways that we can think of. And we're bearing the burden of that now. So when we start talking about kids in the inner city, that could be the only meal they get, right? And this is why no one will ever run on this platform and get elected.
Yeah.
The problem is, you know what has to happen? There needs to be two parents in that home. Or
Right.
if you're a polygamist, three or four. What anyway, mom and dad have to be home, right?
Yeah.
That kid needs instruction. That kid needs structure. That kid needs good food. And we're not getting it doing what we're doing.
Right.
And until we
Uh,
have that makeover, I just don't know what else we can do there. I mean, the school could elect to just have good, clean food, but let's be honest. Have you looked at what it costs to eat good, clean food versus the cost of crap that comes out of a box?
yeah, there's that, and there's the fact that kids in affluent neighborhoods, they'll just go buy their own junk food,
Right.
They'll just, and then you know, share it with all their buddies at school. And it's also kind of upsetting how all our youth night activities, as the Latter-day Saints, we're gonna have, refreshments, right? How many Mormons does it take to screw in a light bulb, right?
Right.
One to screw it in and 10 to bring refreshments. But the problem is, if there's no donuts, I'm not going, that kind of thing, And we we actually when my wife was in the young women presidency in our ward, we we pushed for like, hey, we're not gonna have soda, we're gonna have juice, like 100% juice, or we're not gonna have, you know, these, fried chips, we're gonna try baked chips, or like, nutrition is all about replacing with, making little switches, little things that okay, I can handle that. Make one little step. Another interesting point about that Sachs makes about food is the kids are snacking all the time.
Hmm.
And these moms, they'll bring, if they've got a 20-minute drive to school, they're bringing their kid to school, they bring snacks. And, it's not, not a healthy snack either, usually. And it's like, God forbid that kid experiences 1 minute of hunger. He says in experiments with animals, the animals who have free access to food that they can access anytime, who, you know, um, consume like, X number of calories, they get fatter than the animals who consume the same number of calories, but on a schedule. So in other words, back in the day, this is another virtue of the past is they didn't do all these constant snackings. And another benefit of cutting out the snacks is it drives the parents crazy. Now, I'll say what I mean here is it's not the kitchen's not always open or like it's not always because we don't want to drive mom crazy or the parents crazy by constantly cleaning up and constantly cooking. That's another benefit. And I get it that a kid might need a snack, right? Here and there. But what we're saying is it's not just a constant buffet. So back in the past, they did more of the 3 meals a day. Now, and I get, you don't want to spike the blood sugar by, these massive occasional feasts, but the idea is not having the free access. You mentioned the physical activity. So Sachs definitely talks about that. He says back in 1969, 41% of the kids walked to school or they rode their bike. By 2001, it dropped to 13%. And so if you live within a mile of a grocery store, go on a walk with your kids there, or a mile to church, go walk to church. Walking is like a real human thing that we need to do. Like you said, we need to have as minimal artificial environment as we can. Um, I remember Joel Skousen is one of my, you know, really, really smart mentor. And he says, look, guys, how are we gonna run and not be weary and walk and not faint if we never walk and we never run? So
Right.
um, Dr. Sachs points out there's this kid. He comes to his mom, says, hey, it's a really nice day outside. Why don't you go play outside? And the kid looks at his mom, he says, well, that would be nice, but where would I plug in my Xbox? You know?
Right.
So the pastime of choice used to be playing outside, and now it is switched. Kids would prefer to be on their screens. And and this is another instance where we are letting the kids make decisions that are going to harm them. The parents need to step up and say, hey, no, this is the limit we're going to have. If you are doing the screens, keep it to under an hour. Um, you know, and I'm all for, the educational in the Christian movies that show us how to be Christians and how to be educated. But the basic idea is these things are addictive. They're high dopamine things that uh where we're no longer sensitive to the reality of normal life. It's no longer exciting to go play outside because they're getting all this really high stimulation from their games and the other and even the foods too. The junk foods are so high triggering dopamine that it's going to make it so the apple is no longer appealing because you're so hyped up on all this other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then he says that when we let the kids kind of rule the roost, there's actually an interesting statistic that your defiant and disrespectful kids are 3 times as likely to be obese as respectful kids.
Interesting.
And that might have to do with, hey, you know, I'm not going to eat that. I need this, you know, and the parents having just little to no authority on what they do that way. So maybe let's turn the topic and talk about one of the big points in Dr. Sax's book is medication. Why so many kids are on medication in America. Ready to go there?
I'm ready for that.
Okay. Um, you mentioned you had Anne Blake Tracy on your show. She's amazing. Um, so one of the things that, well, Dr. Sachs says that in America, we have more diagnosis and more medication than anywhere else in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And even in those cases where diagnosis is appropriate, in America, we're the people who jump to, and here's your medication.
Yep.
You got a diagnosis, that means you need a medication. Where even an ADHD diagnosis, there are lots of ways to naturally treat that. There's even um, natural ADHD medications that aren't stimulants. Um, a lot of these guys who do the heavy drugs, they'll report, that they had the Ritalin and all this that was kind of a gateway. America has this problem to where the medication is the first line of defense. There's this family from Europe who moved to America, and she said, as soon as I got to America, all my kids' school teachers and doctors were just constantly pressuring me to put my kid on medication. And it wasn't like that in Europe. And so these other places around the world, they're not as trigger happy. Um, we're so listen to this. For every one child in England giving a bipolar disorder, 73 children in the United States are given that bipolar disorder. Bipolar is typically where you're gonna have these mood swings that, a couple months of the manic and a couple months of the depressive. But in children, they call it rapid cycling. If they see a kid who, they're really happy at this moment, and then they're like bawling at this next moment, in these 10-minute or just really short cycles, they call it rapid cycling. And they're in these very young age diagnosis of bipolar on that. And that's actually what we call being a child. It doesn't mean you have bipolar. Um, so we're going over the top with that. And again, it gets back to this: parents, discipline, teach, correct, mentor, be highly involved, be home, be willing to tell your kid no, all this that the parents aren't doing now. And so these kids, you take them to the grocery store, and they're, I'm never going to fault a parent who's in this situation with the screaming kid at the grocery store, right? The grocery stores are just so flashy and so sophisticated in how they're set up to get even adults. So of course it's going to get kids too, but generally speaking, these kids that are acting out at school, they're acting out everywhere. It's because of a collapse of parenting, and the way that we solve this collapse is by diagnosing and medicating. We give the kids Risperidol, Seroquel, other adult bipolar drugs. So,
Yeah.
one, sorry, go
Go
ahead.
ahead. No, you. Sorry, I thought you were finished.
Uh, a big thing of ADHD is sleep deprivation. If your child is sleep deprived, they will, the signs of ADHD and sleep deprivation are basically the same. So a lot of the time it means pulling that screen out of their bedroom. And, because these kids will stay up, till 3 a.m. on their screens, and the parents won't even know sometimes. Um, and yeah, so we're medicating these kids with mood stabilizers. They're under 12 years old. The use of these mood stabilizers and antipsychotics for these young children went up 700% between 1993 and 2009. From 2009 to 2013, there was a tenfold increase in American ADHD diagnosis. And the sad thing is, when these kids are on these ADHD medications, they can get long-term results of not being able to feel normal feelings, to where the classic, they have to keep changing the dosage amount because this tolerance, and they get the increased dopamine, so they're used to this high stimulation world, to where the normal world is no longer works for them. So the non-stimulant ones you want to go for, if your kid has these problems, he suggests Strattera, Intuitive, Intuitive, and Wellbutrin. So those, and there's another great book on this, is the Boy Crisis by Warren Farrell. There's a whole big section on that book on treating ADHD naturally, because yeah, it is a big problem, and we just want to steer away from the medication as much as we can.
But well, okay, now I'm going to push back here a little bit on that. Is it a big problem? Is it a big problem?
ADHD. So I've heard both ways. The point that Dr. Sachs makes is he thinks we do overdiagnose. Dr. Farrell in Boy Crisis, he talks about how, even if they do need this diagnosis, they're still, we don't need to jump to medicating. So, but I do with you lean towards, yeah, so this is the problem, Dave. When we're eating all this junk food, when we're having kids sit in a classroom for 8 hours, when we're doing all these unnatural things, they are going to develop more problems,
Yeah.
So we do have, our kids are getting more and more messed up.
But that's where I'm going with this is that the problems we're having, I don't think is all of a sudden this explosion of just um hormonally imbalanced children.
No, no.
Um if why is it that people who were maybe on the quote spectrum somehow managed to get through life just fine before all the drugs?
Yeah.
Um, look, I'm a lot of this you have to make personal, right? And so I'm going to share a story here that I think I may have shared with Ann Blake Tracy on that episode. I can't remember. If not, then I'm breaking some news. Our twins, our last two twins that we got, we adopted, and they were in rough shape when we got them because their mother, my sister, had done meth while they were in utero. And our son he was wired, right? He was just all over the map, right? And we kept having teachers saying he needs to be on Ritalin, he needs to be on medication, and just pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed. We didn't know better. We should have known better, but we didn't at that time. He was probably in the fourth grade, and I'm like, fine, we'll give this a try. And we had him on it from fourth to seventh grade, and he was just a shell of himself, right? And I remember one night he came in and he just sat next to me. I'm like, "Are you okay?" And he just looked at me. He said, "Dad, I can't feel anything."
Oh gosh.
And I, I wept in that moment because I knew I had failed at the one thing I tried so hard to do, which was to be a good parent. And so that night I got on my knees and I said, "God, what is it you want me to do here? I do not understand. Help me understand." And in a flash, it was get him off the drugs. If it was
Nice.
drugs that got him to this point, right? That was the initial cause of him being wired. What makes you think drugs are going to be the solution?
Yeah.
And I
It's
fully expect to get flagged on this and to the hell with it.
yeah.
But we we took him off that medication, and within about 4 months he leveled out. Now, he was still an active kid. I still had teachers pissing and moaning, and finally we just took him out.
Yeah.
But guess what? We took him out. We did an online program with him. He flew through that because he didn't have to work at a slower pace. So he would
Yeah.
fly through that. He would go to the work in the afternoons. He had friends. He was active. He was a different kid,
It's
right?
flourishing.
Now, here's what I've seen, and I'm just going to call it like I see it. I'm not a doctor. I want to preface it with this. But why is it we started having school shootings about 10 years after we really started medicating young men? And it's disproportionately young men who are getting medicated over the girls. Why is that? Why did we see that uptick? Well, I look back when I was a kid, we all had shotguns in the back of our truck, right?
Yep.
We would go to football practice, and then it's like, okay, we're heading to Okuda's farm where we have access, where he's giving it to us, and we're going to blast away at ducks till dark, right? There was never an incident. What happened? Well, look, I'm not a doctor, but I am a thinker, right? And if the boys that we put on Ritalin and those psychotropics, when they became teenagers and we started seeing an uptick in school shootings, that should have been a damn giveaway that something was wrong. And I want to make it clear that I don't think it's only the drugs. I think that certain video games, right? Those first person shooters, right?
Yep.
If you have a desensitized kid already, and then you further desensitize him through violence, but that violence is the only thing that spikes his dopamine,
Right.
what the hell do you expect to happen?
Right.
It makes no sense. We have got to stop. Again, it's maddening because I see the world going over the cliff and no one's willing to call this out, Nate. No one's willing to say these drugs are part of the problem. They're not part of the solution.
Yeah. Yeah, Dave. The thing is, we're not being anti-science here. We're saying the science is showing that we were deceived. We were deceived by Big Pharma. We were deceived on so many levels. We're deceived by Big Food now, thinking that all these Frankenfoods are okay and they're not. And part of the exodus out of Babylon is going to be we're leaving behind these high stimulus games, these first person shooters, these high stimulus foods. And you know, the shooter games, like you said, they're going to get a kid where he's desensitized. He's going to be, and we have this problem with, obviously it's important that we have serve in the military, but it's a fact that when you serve in the military, you need to unwind for a while because you're in kill mode and you're not as much in feel mode. And you a lot of veterans, they will have the depression and the suicide higher because they're used to that fast-paced life, that high dopamine life of the danger response, emergency, um, and real life isn't like that.
No,
God hates war, and I get that we do need to defend ourselves, and we do need to protect each other and to not just get stepped on. The Book of Mormon is not a pacifist book.
no,
Uh, and that's another thing is as parents, we can't be pacifists. We have to be involved. There's things worse than, let's, the quintessential example of controversy in parenting, the spank, right? Or whatever it is. There's things worse than that. Is it sad and all that? Yeah. Is it ideal? Probably not. But there's things that are worse. If that's the tool in your toolbox that is gonna be the most effective at that time, at that problem, because for example, what's worse? People getting taken advantage of by tyrants or having a war, having a revolution. And obviously there's dangers, but yeah, we're not pacifists. The scriptures are not pacifist. This doesn't mean, the middle of the Book of Mormon does have an account where the people lay down their lives, the anti-Nephi Lehis, right? The covenant, hey, we've been
right.
way overboard on the war. We need to step it back. We're not getting involved anymore. We're done. And this is kind of how we're apologizing for how how we were out of balance in the past. But then they go ahead and have their sons go to war, you know, because so they're not saying like at all times, war is bad. Um, so when it comes to that was a little tangent, but it was important. And the anti-science, yeah, that's what we were talking about. So yeah, these studies are showing that all these medications that we're giving our kids, it's pretty crazy. And we're finding out that, oh crap, we the controls were not in place, and major problems are happening now. One of the really smart parenting tips that I like from this book was, he said these first person shooters, for one thing, they it's glorifying the violence, but for two, it's that high dopamine, right? So he
Hmm.
says, what are we going to do about it? Well, for one, obviously don't have them in your home. But for two, and this is the bold part, don't let your kid go to play at a house where these kind of games are going to be played,
Hmm.
because we have to expect that our kids will behave even when they're not at our house. And
Yep.
there's this popular mantra of, oh, kids will be kids, and you can't control them all the time, and they've got to go and sure, and um, I'm sure Oprah, promotes that a lot. It's not really based by the studies. He even suggests, hey, drop in on your kids if they're at somebody's house on an activity or something. You can drop in unannounced because you expect them to behave the same way at home as you do at school. And then this ties into the school discipline too. It used to be that the parents and the administrators of the school were on the same team, to where if you got in trouble at school, you came home and guess what? Your parents got you in more trouble, right? Because the parents expect the kids to behave themselves even when they're not at home. And that's integrity, right? It's what you do when no one's looking. And that's what we're trying to do, is train our kids to have integrity. So,
But isn't that assuming that the school and I hate going back to this, but I gotta call a spade here. That's assuming the school has your same values.
yeah, that's decreasingly true. I remember when I was a kid, the elder Robert D. Hales gave a talk where he said it used to be that society, um, the standards of society and the standards of the church are like close, but now they're way apart.
Yeah.
And that's always stuck with me. And then
Well,
Elder Cook recently said, we're not living in a Christian society anymore. We're in a post-Christian society. And so what we need to realize is that basically the end is near. We're not a Christian nation anymore. We can't keep relying on other people to raise our kids. So,
And look, I'll be the first guy to admit this too. I remember I got called in once with my oldest boy. I got the call at work. Hey, your kid was fighting. You gotta come get him. And I went in, and there was my son, the kid he knocked out, and I could tell that because the kid was bleeding. And then there was this little Down syndrome boy that was there too, but his shirt was all wet. He looked horrible. And I take my son into the principal's office and I say, okay, let's talk. What happened here? And he
Yeah.
said, well, he knocked out this other kid. And I just looked at him and I said, Tyler, why'd you do that? And he said, well, he dumped his milk on this Down syndrome boy.
Oh,
And I got mad and I cleaned his clock.
yeah.
And I'll admit, Nate, I looked deadpan right in the eyes of that principal. I said, you can kick him out, but understand this is going to be a vacation for him. I'm going
Yeah.
to take him home. We're going to probably stop and get ice cream on the way home. And then I may fire him up a game of Madden to let him play.
Yeah.
Because here's the thing, right? In the old days, like, look, I've been in plenty of school fights, right?
Yeah.
And very rarely did they result in me getting suspended. Usually it was, I know your football coach and you'll be running extra laps, right? And then the coach would be like, what'd you do? And I'll explain the whole thing. And sometimes I was running extra laps, and sometimes he was like, don't do that crap again, but I get it.
Yeah.
We can't make the assumption any longer that the school has the same morals, values, and principles that we do, because they don't. Um, they talk a good game about just being on the side of that kid, but that's not what they're saying. What they're
Yeah.
saying is we want our values and principles instilled in your kid, not yours.
Yeah. Absolutely. Um, so yeah, we've talked about the education part here and there. He he points out how um our the most successful schools around the world are those that don't have the tech gadgets. In other words, we don't have to turn our classrooms into arcade rooms. It's the schools with the good old pencil and paper, and the board on the wall is just a board that you write on, and how there's really not evidence that flooding the kids with all these gadgets and stuff is making them actually learn any better. Um, and how when we let the kids um, be, rule the roost, be the disrespect, um, that makes it so that there's this argument that, hey, in America, yeah, we're rude, but we're also creative. We have a history of being the inventors, obviously, but there's nothing creative about telling a teacher to shut up. Um, and the studies show that on all the measures of creativity, we're just falling down fast and hard.
Mhm.
America used to have this moral backbone, and I think that's why we're blessed by God to be the inventors. We were the highest in the education, and now we're getting falling way down in the ranks. Um, yeah, the American students, um, even in the colleges, they're not learning hardly anything. On measures of cognitive skill, critical thinking, and reasoning, on a 100-point scale of where a kid is at when they go to college, only a third of them are going up more than 1 point on that 100-point scale of the cognitive skill and reasoning and critical thinking. So, um, yeah, the argument that we have to let the kids do what they want to be creative, um, it's just more propaganda nonsense. Because our kids now are being they're less energetic, they're less emotionally expressive, they're less talkative, they're less verbally expressive, they're less humorous, less unconventional, less lively, less passionate, less perceptive, less able to connect irrelevant things. In other words, they are less creative. So,
Okay, look, I want to ask you a question about the critical thinking part, because I see that in sharp decline.
yeah,
What's the reasoning for the lack of critical thinking?
I don't know. It seems like the lack of rigor is a part of it when our schools are. you know. Um, if we have to do everything the kids' way, you know, uh, educators, they get, if the kid complains about how, this teacher grades too hard or this teacher gives too hard assignments. In other words, this teacher has actual authority in their classroom and they're telling us how it's going to be, then, that's the teacher that the parents are complaining, and they're getting the school administrators are getting those phone calls of, hey, this teacher's no good. He's not, being compassionate. He's not working with the kid. So basically the parents are taking the kid's side. They're not backing up the teacher when the teacher tries to have high standards in behavior and academics, rather than the parents saying, yeah, you need to shape up, kid. It's, oh my goodness, we need to, you know call and get that teacher fired. So the the parents have lost their identity as a leader with authority, and they're now just someone who tries to be one more friend of the kid, right?
Okay, I could accept that. Let
Yeah.
me let me give you another scenario. And again, I'm going to pick on public education.
Oh yeah.
Um, we don't teach kids how to think anymore. We teach them what to think.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that is a major departure from this idea of critical thinking. I once attended a seminar put on by wall builders. I don't know if you know who they are.
Yeah, McCulloch.
Uh, this one was with David Barton and his
Oh
son.
yeah. Okay, maybe that's what I meant. Yeah.
And he went over what school used to be. And so basically, in the classroom, you can't do this with mathematics necessarily because it's very, very rigid. 2 plus 2 does equal 4. But on things like history, things on social studies, even literature, they would tell the kids back in the old days, you need to read this and you need to understand both sides because in 2 days, I'm going to ask you to debate one side or the other. So you better know the argument for both
Yeah.
sides. We don't teach kids how to think anymore. We just teach them what to think. And I do believe it's by design. I don't think they want a society any longer. And when I say they, I mean the elites. They don't want critical thinkers any longer. They just want yes people, right?
For
Um,
sure.
you're going to go to this cubicle. You're going to sit in this cubicle. You're going to do this job for the next however many years. Maybe you change jobs, but this is what you do. That doesn't lend itself to this idea of critical thinking. They need cogs in the machine. And I think the public education bears some responsibility in this, right? They at some point somewhere changed, and they used to call it catechizing. There's no more catechizing in school. It's all just spit this answer back out to me.
Yeah.
And that's a sad state of affairs. That will raise someone who's not capable of critical thought.
Yeah, I would agree that the political environment, we're very liberal in the education world. Um, you know, the vast majority of college professors are all liberal. And I remember there's this funny meme I saw where it showed the Star Wars scene where there's a couple of these, Jedi, and they're surrounded by just thousands of of the other team, and they're like surrounded and trying to defend themselves, and it's obviously a lost cause. And the caption on the meme was basically like conservative college professors, but if our schools are socialist, yeah, we're going to be turning them into workers. We're not going to be turning them into leaders. And we just, it's it's not good. The prophets have spoken against communism at length, and um now it's got the fancy hat called socialism, and people don't see how they're, one leading to the other. So you made a good point. One of the things, as as he later in the book, he talks about how um parents, the theme is the parents need to be the boss, all this. Um, we have this idea, and I touched on it a little bit when we talked about the food, how we tried offering both healthy and unhealthy food at the same time, and it didn't work because the kids, you know, were being asked to do something that's just totally beyond their their ability to, basically their biological ability to say no to some of this stuff that's offered them. The idea is you don't teach um, virtue by teaching. You have to do it by showing. You have to require them to do virtuous behavior. Um, so the parents can't just say, "Hey, I hope you do this." The parents have to actually drag them out of bed, take them to go to a service project, and see the kid can experience, "Hey, wow, this actually feels good, and I actually like helping my older neighbor or whatever it is." Um, same thing with the food. You require them to eat the good food, and it's like, "Oh, I actually like being healthy," and um, and I get it that none of us are perfect, and as far as parenting goes, there's not a perfect parent. Um, there's a funny thing Hugh Nibley said. He said, "I'm not a good teacher. Let me know if you ever find one. I've never seen a good teacher. Let me know if you ever find one." And I feel like the same thing goes for parenting. It's like I'm not a good parent. I've never really seen a good parent. Let me know if you ever find one. But the pendulum has swung too far. We are too lackadaisical with our kids. Parents back in the day had more authority. Um, in the Hebrew, the Dr. Sachs points out that in the book of Deuteronomy, it says, "Teach your children diligently," right?
Mm-hmm.
So the Hebrew doesn't say teach them diligently. It says inscribe them on your children. And the verb it uses is shannon, which means to cut with a knife. So when we're saying teach them diligently, it's watered down. What we're really supposed to be doing with our kids is just almost, the word you could use is relentlessly uh, showing them what God's ways are, and yeah, it really kind of shoots ourselves in the foot when in the feet when we send them to schools that are godless. Um, we have to show them what it means to be virtuous. You teach them about Mother Teresa so they know what it's like to be a selfless person. We have to teach them about um, real relationships so they're not doing the porn and the masturbation. We have to show them what real adventures are so they're not just doing the video games. Um, we have to set limits. Sending them off. Does your kid really need a cell phone? Dr. Sachs points out how a lot of the parents will be the ones who complain. If your kid's the one who doesn't have the phone, a lot of the kids are like, "Yeah, no, he just doesn't have a phone. That's fine." But the parents are like, "Oh my gosh, what are you doing?" Because these parents I'm not saying nobody can give their kid a phone. I'm saying it's going to vary case by case, of course, based on your kid's maturity and what his needs are, and how responsible he is. But I mean, the parents who are overindulgent, they often get they harass the parents who are responsible because they feel bad about, subconsciously perhaps, about how they're being overindulgent. And so when you're raising your kid with limits, when you're being the authority figure in that kid's life, you're going to have neighbors, you're going to have church people, you're going to have everybody saying you're being too strict, you're being too religious, you're doing this and that. But that's part of the Christian cross, is being willing to have that persecution of our friends, our family, um, saying that we're doing it wrong, we're going to ruin our kids by being too strict. So it's a big thing that it's one of the crosses that a responsible parent is going to face when he does his job. The job description of a parent is to help the kid explore their full potential, and that potential isn't in the gaming for 20 hours a week. And a lot of these kids, they'll come to their parent and they'll say, "Hey, I want to be a professional gamer. I want to," and the parents might say, "Oh, then nobody can do that." And like, "Oh yeah, they can." And it's true, there are the professional gamers, but is that your potential in life? Like, is that why you're here on Earth? Is that how you're going to maximize who you are? And the answer is no. And the parent needs to be the person who can say, who can break their bubble and say, hey, sorry, man, you're not going to the NBA. I'm sorry, man, you're not going to be that video game tester. Like, sorry, man, um, you're not going to, be a heart surgeon. Like, somebody's got to have that tough love to expose to them these things. And that doesn't mean you don't encourage them, but it means you need to be the person in the room who loves them enough to give them a reality check and to help them make like realistic goals, not just live in this fairyland of all these bizarre careers, bizarre, fantasy lives. Does that kind of make sense?
No, that makes sense. So here's what I've discovered. So I've raised 6 kids now, and somehow this is more due to their mom than me. Somehow they've all turned out to be productive. I don't know how, but they have. Um, Here's what we always told our kids, right? Because our kids had dreams that they wanted to fulfill, right? Rather than shoot those down, because I don't believe that we should necessarily limit our kids' potential either, right?
Right, right.
If they have a goal they want to go attain it. But what I've always told my kids is have a backup in mind.
Yeah, that's
I
a nice way to
remember
do it.
my son was really good at basketball, really good. And then one day I had to have an uncomfortable conversation with him and be like, look, you're not 6'7", you're not black. The chances of you being able to make it as a pro basketball player are slim to none, my man. However, I don't want you to give up on your dream, but let's have like something to fall back on. Let's just pretend you don't get to your place. What else would you like to do? Right? In the case of my boy, he was like, well, I suppose um, if I couldn't be a basketball player, I would like to be the guys who like tape them up, the physical therapists. And
Yeah.
I'm like, perfect. Then you know what? Make that your backup plan. Right. And then as he got to about 17, he's like, oh yeah, this ain't happening for me. I'm not even getting a scholarship. Right.
Yeah.
Um, but he had something else in mind. So I'm not a big proponent of squash your kid's dream, but
Yeah.
maybe have a backup there, right? I want
Yeah,
to
that's
go
good.
I want to go back to the thing with discipline, right? I never had to spank my kids once they were past the age of like 8. Normally by then they had
Yeah.
most things figured out, right? So
Yeah.
so I would say, there's an age at which hopefully if you've done your job, you can get away
Right.
from that. The other thing I'll say is that sometimes as a parent, I found I had to get inventive with discipline. Let me give you a story, an
Oh
example.
yeah.
My daughter, who was always a good girl, my oldest daughter, super responsible. She tested me for about 6 months of her life. And I remember once, and this is when we lived in Boise. Um, and it was right after Christmas, and as a gag gift, because I used to sit down with my youngest kids and we'd watch SpongeBob and laugh. But as a gag gift, they got me a pair of SpongeBob pajama bottoms that
Uh-huh.
were maybe a little too tight. And one day, my daughter, she says, hey, I want to go with these older girls to the mall. Can I go? And I was like, sweetheart, I'd really prefer that you didn't. I don't know these girls. Let's kind of, why don't I meet them first and then we'll see. And she's like, okay. And then she went downstairs. About an hour later, I was like, I haven't seen her. I better go check on her. She had snuck off, but I had a pretty good idea of where she was going to be.
Uh-huh.
So what I did is I went in and I found the tightest fitting t-shirt that I could find along with those SpongeBob pajamas. And I tracked her down because I had an app on her phone. And as I walked into JC
Good
Penney's where
call on
she was
that. Yeah.
shopping with this other girl, I walked in right behind her and I'm like, yo, dog, can I hang? And she turned around and just to her horror, I am wearing clothes that were way too tight, way too loud, and way too obnoxious. From that point on, I could always look at her and be like, sweetheart, do we need to go to the mall and go shopping? And she'd straighten right up. So
Nice.
there are ways that you can discipline as well that are just as effective as anything else. but you just knowing how to discipline your kid requires that you know your kid, right? I knew for my
Absolutely.
daughter that her social circle was really important to her. And if the old man was, trying to hang out with her looking like a fool, that was going to do
Yeah.
as much as anything else. So I would
Um,
say in this disciplining your kid, get to know your kid. And here's the great news, because they're your kids, you're uniquely qualified to come up with that.
yeah, you have the authority to do that. You're the, you know, your ecclesiastical leaders don't, there's lines of authority, right? To where you get to be the parent and you get to get the revelation for that. Um, one of the um, one of the things that I wanted to read was this Joseph Smith again. He talks about how involved, this applies to how involved a parent has to be. Says if children are to be brought up in the way they should go to be good citizens here and happy hereafter, they must be taught. It is idle to suppose that children will grow up good while surrounded with wickedness without cultivation. It is folly to suppose they can become learned without education. So, in other words, we need to educate their desires. Um, show them the classical music so they can recognize that the garbage on the radio is nonsense. We have to expose them to all the good, or else they're not going to be able to um to be able to recognize. They're still going to be in the world, but they'll be able to see, kind of like when Moses, he met with the devil, and then after he met with the Lord, and he's like, no, I'm not interested in the devil's stuff, because I know what it's like. I know what the real life is. I know what the good life is. um and kids will kick and scream, like, oh, you're not gonna let me do this, you're not gonna let me do that. I can't have my boyfriend over in my bedroom, like some of these things that we're gonna draw the line and say, no way, Jose. um these kids might think, Dr. Sachs, he says these kids will think, gosh, I'm gonna need therapy from all the trauma my parents are putting me through. But then those kids grow up and they see that it's all the other kids whose parents were very permissive that just let them kind of run wild. Those are the kids that needed the therapy. Those are the kids whose lives were a wreck. So the kids who are well-rounded, they're being required, rigorous chores even. If it doesn't require an electric current, Dr. Sachs says, get your own family to do it. Work with them, and show them that real life means work. He talks about one family who they a recreation they had was this kid gets to play baseball. But after the baseball game was over, it was time to do the chores, and the other kids were going out for a meal after the baseball game, and these parents were like, no, sorry, you had your break time. I don't mean break time. Um, because we're not like
Recreation.
constantly requiring our kids to work, right? They're not slaves, but we are trying to get them to cultivate, to be wise with their time. Anyway, this family on this occasion, they said, no, we're not doing that after game lunch because we got stuff to do. But the general principle there is, um, you know, the family comes first, and the kids don't get to, the peers. That's not the top priority. So, um,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Absolutely. All right. What else is in there for us?
I um Thomas Sowell, he said, each new generation is born in effect each new generation born is in effect an invasion of civilization by little barbarians who must be civilized before it is too late.
No,
So, yeah. That's about all I have, but
that's good stuff. That's good stuff.
yeah.
Anything you want to say in conclusion?
um Sachs, he says the culture of social media is the antithesis of humility. And a lot of the time, if your kid is remaining rude, if your kid's rude and remaining rude, social media is often the root problem. So parents, please be careful about how much these kids are getting access to social media. Um, the prince of the air, right? The Bible calls the devil the prince of the air.
Mm-hmm.
So watch out for that's a big one. They're getting taught if they spend a lot of time on these social media platforms, they're learning that that's what matters. You know, what how you did your makeup is a really important part of your identity when it's not. And so just really toning down the time, if any, access to those things can be a big one of the solutions there too. But again, the parent, that's where the parent is exercising his or her authority to say what will and will not fly, and that's the parent's job. Even if your kid doesn't like you, a lot of the Dr. Sachs says a lot of the kids will, I don't like you. They say this to their parents, and he says the parent's job description is not to have your kids like you. As hard as that is, your job as a parent is to be responsible, to train up your kid in what's gonna be the best for them, even if they go for some chapters of their lives resenting you for it. So,
Good
yep.
stuff. All right. I'll wrap up with this. I said this earlier, and I really, really mean it. The time for half measures is over.
Absolutely.
And we are now in a war for the souls of our children. Understand that. It's an actual war for the souls of our kids. The adversary wants them. There's a reason that every dictator that has ever existed has almost always had some sort of youth program. Whether that was the Hitler Youth, whether that was Mao, whether that was Stalin and Lenin, they all had some sort of youth program. We are in a fight for the souls of our children. That's not being hyperbolic. That is not me overstating the case. It is the truth. If we are on a war footing, we may have to do some stuff that seem somewhat over the top. But that's just the callings of our times. Um, if you are a family that has to have two incomes to make it work, might be time to think about really reassessing where it is you're living and what kind of conveniences are worth your kids' soul.
Right.
And I don't know how else to put that. And I get that there's going to be a lot of people mad at me, but I'm just going to call it like I see it. If that's the case, maybe it's time to move. Maybe it's time to find some place where you can afford to live off of one income. They're out there, believe it or not. You just
Yeah.
have to look and you just have to be willing to sacrifice. Next, we better get real comfortable with the idea that we can start educating our own children. The public school system is lost. Okay. It's lost morally. Look at the amount of rooms that have, and I'm sorry, the rainbow flags draped up there. Okay.
Yep.
That's prevalent now. It's not just the one weird teacher who smoked a little too much dope in school, right?
Right.
It's everywhere now. Here's the good news. You as parents are uniquely qualified to not just teach your children morals and good behavior. You're uniquely qualified to educate your children. And it's never really been easier than what it is now. There's all sorts of alternative programs you can have your kids in. There's all sorts of curricula out there for you. And if you don't know how to do it, YouTube's got plenty of suggestions on this. Just like it's a tool for the adversary to spew crap, it's also a tool for God to put out good content. And there is good content out there. But the days of passive parenting are over. They no longer work. We have moved into a different frame of existence. And it's time to recognize that and act accordingly. Because make no doubt, we are in a war for the souls of our children.
Yeah.
Nate, dude, that was good stuff. we'll get you back on again for something else. All right.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Awesome. All right. Bye, everybody.